Hey guys, so what's been happening in the hobby this week? Well, I thought this week we'd talk about the impact of 3D printing on our hobby and tabletop miniatures in general, and yeah, everything that surrounds that, because it is going through, I guess, an explosion of content, just almost like a golden age kind of thing, or we're coming into a golden age of sort of accessibility for a large variety of miniatures and sculpts and stuff like that we can utilize for our war games. And it's a really interesting time to be in the hobby right now, and I'm part of that, as many independent creators are, producing content for either their own brands like I'm doing, Blight of Gods, or working for companies and producing, independent companies producing products and so on for various types of war games, either their own ones or as substitutes for other war games. So I've got a little selection here in front of me. I've got some Warhammer stuff here with some 3D parts that I've sculpted myself personally for my own hobby and so on, and then I've got some of my own sculpts for my brand Blight of Gods. And so you can see the sort of range. I thought I'd just put some in front here to talk about it. So I guess the big questions are, how is 3D printing going to impact the future of things, companies that are producing, resin cast, plastic kits and so on models for their war games that they produce, and what that's going to look like in the future, and how accessible is 3D printing anyway, and is that something that you is going to be doing what we think it will, which is what most people think, is that it's going to eventually become the way in which you interact with this type of product. So and there's a lot of indication that it's excelling at such a rapid rate in terms of the technology to print, that it does look like it might end up becoming so easy to do that it does in fact overtake more traditional means of producing miniatures and so on. So I guess there's a lot to break down here, and I don't want to go into all of those. It'll take hours to break down all of these topics. It's really just to highlight the impact of this, and really more to look at the positive side of how cool it is that we have this resource at our disposal to increase our enjoyment of these toys that we love to play with, right? So I guess the biggest one is how it can improve and help your hobby for an existing war game like Warhammer. So there is a lot of contention there. There are a lot of companies that produce Warhammer like models so that you can proxy in, and there's a few questions here to deal with, I guess, when you're looking at that. Is one, things like piracy and copying and plagiarism and that kind of thing, but then there is also the arguments against that and that sort of thing. And so I guess the first thing is to look at how far is going too far when you're producing or putting out content that is basically either a rip-off or a very close proximity to a design that something like Games Workshop might have produced, like a Space Marine or whatever, right? And where is the line drawn, and what's okay and what's not? It's a very grey area, and I don't want to get into the arguments for and against that as well, because that's a very, very complex topic. I've got a personal investment in this particular argument because I produce my own content, you know what I mean? So I understand both sides of this equation. I've been both and I've also worked for Games Workshop as well, so I've been on multiple sides of this argument, and I'm also an independent creator, so I also see the value of protecting your own work and so on. So I guess the first argument is is it okay to 3D print stuff that is or very close approximation to Warhammer stuff and proxy it? And I guess from my own point of view, most of that is fine if it's for personal use, as long as you're not blatantly trying to rip off somebody else, and that's not really the person consuming the product, but it's more the person creating that in the first place. So there's lots of varying issues here, but for the most part, if it's for personal use only, there's not that much of a drama or that much of a thing going on there. It's more when you then go out and try to either publicly show, promote, sell, take a transaction from that, or make money from it, or in some way reproduce beyond just personal use. And I think that's mostly where you're going to find the problem. If I, with my own stuff, even though, so then you get this issue where, you're producing, let's say, STL files like these are, that you can then reproduce on a 3D printer. You can do as many copies as you like, right? That's the whole point of 3D printing. But then where does it become piracy or that? Well, for me, it would be, yeah, that's fine for you to 3D print these, but then if you were to then go and sell them on your own store or make money from that, from reproductions, that's where you're crossing the line. Or if you're then not even just that far, but if you're then, let's say you're taking Warhammer models and then you're making molds and little press fit molds and so on, but then let's say it's just for your own personal thing and you don't do anything with it, that's all harmless. But the moment you cross over and you start, let's say, making tutorials on how to make molds to cast, reproduce other people's stuff, or you're getting into this realm of sharing the knowledge of how to do this sort of stuff or how to reproduce, well, then you're getting into a gray area, because even though you might have the best of intentions, someone else viewing that work may not, and they may then go out and then try to sell this stuff. So there's a whole issue there in terms of how you, not even if you're trying to make money on, but just even sharing the knowledge. So you have to be very considered about what you share and what you show. There's no problems in showing, like this stuff that you've done yourself and so on, like little conversions and all that sort of thing. We all sculpt with green stuff and create, stuff like that, or with plastic, or in this case, sculpting and adding parts that we make ourselves. That's no problem. But if you're scanning whole models and you're doing stuff like that and you're getting into like really accurate reproduction, that's a problem. As I said, if it's just within yourself and you're not publicly showing any of that, then no harm, no foul. But yeah, the moment you go into a public space and you start promoting that and you start, receiving a kind of reciprocation, even if there's no money changing hands, yeah, you're going to end up in hot water there. And so that's really, how is 3D printing going to, contend with this type of problem in the future? Because most companies, including Games Workshop, will probably end up having to embrace it as a way that they put out their products. Obviously Games Workshop will be very slow to take to that, but they probably will as well eventually, if 3D printing technology continues the way it's going. Where it is right now, I feel that it's not at a point where it's really a problem for them. If you have a look at how they've been going, even within a pandemic during COVID, they're still making great profit, right? Their company really hasn't been affected by COVID at all, apart from certain logistical issues they've had over the recent times. But apart from that, and that hasn't stopped their profit, right? If you take a look at the company and how it's trading, it's doing very well. So one of those few companies in the world that really hasn't seen much of an effect of COVID at all, really. It's been basically just been very lucky. And so it's certainly not feeling the effects of 3D printing right now. Their company is just going from strength to strength. And part of that is because of 3D printing isn't quite at the point where it's plug and play, where you're just, putting stuff in and getting stuff out, in a very, very immediate kind of way. It takes a lot of time investment, a lot of energy, a lot of understanding and knowledge to produce stuff on a printer. You do need some kind of, it is like almost a hobby in and of itself, right? Or a craft. You need to understand it, learn, and you work with it. It also has if you're doing resin printing, it's, carcinogenic stuff. It's not really good for young kids to be around, the fumes and so on. There's a few areas of safety that are required, which isn't as much safety required when you're just buying a plastic kit. I mean, yes, you've got like clippers and so on and glue, but that's pretty minimal dangers for the average person with a little bit of supervision, for a kid anyway, as opposed to something like liquid resin, which is going to be very harmful if they get that in their eyes or so on, right? So you've still got this kind of barrier there of entry that I feel needs to be overcome in order for 3D printing to become the mainstay of how these kind of products are consumed. So until then, companies like Games Workshop that produce really high-end, high-quality plastic kits are always going to have an edge on 3D printing. It's not really going to take over, but it may very well do once we move on to the next level of technology. And so to move on from the subject of things like piracy and copyright and so on, which you're free to have your own opinion. For myself personally, I think personal use is one thing, and then it's another thing again once you move into a public space. And so that's I think where the issues lie. So, you know, these little guys here, you know, I sculpted my own. These are like Blight of Gods sort of claws, I guess. They've got my own, you know, markings and so on, and I just did this for myself, you know, sculpted and 3D printed them because I didn't have access to lightning claws, so I just made some for these guys, you know, and you know, I'm not selling those, they're not available anywhere. It's just for me personally, right? So there's no issues there from that sort of thing. And same with this, I made a plate, this front plate here, and that's just for my own personal army. As I said, these aren't products that you can buy. I'm not trying to say use them instead of Games Workshop products, nothing like that. It's just for my own personal hobby. So and you know, and I've actually physically sculpted them. I haven't scanned anything. I haven't, you know, done any of that. I've literally, you know, done all of the work inside of a 3D program, sculpted it out, done my tests, fitted it, and so on. And just like a normal conversion, like you would if you were sculpting with green stuff, basically. It's essentially a green stuff conversion, just without green stuff. So in that way, you know, it's very self-contained, and that's the kind of converting with 3D printing that I think is the acceptable way to do it, is to, you know, do your own sculpts, do your own stuff, just like you would with green stuff, 3D print those parts out and do your conversions. Or if you've got third-party parts that you want to kit bash and make into it, that's all fine, you know, if it's just for personal use. I don't really see much of a problem with that. And there's a ton of great Patreons out there and stuff like that that produce their own parts, which aren't just straight knockoffs of Games Workshop. There are plenty of like more innovative and interesting sculpts out there that you could use for your own stuff that is going in their own direction, you know, their own thing. And that's great, and definitely support those artists that are doing their own thing. That's awesome. So, and then you come into, so moving on from that sort of topic, you've then got all of your creator-based sculpts like this, where they're literally their own thing. They're not trying to compete with tabletop miniature games and stuff like that at all. They're trying to push for, you know, the craft and love of miniature stuff, you know, in and of itself. So things like busts and other scales, larger scales and so on. You're getting into like a more sort of, I guess, art space with 3D printing, or even their own scales for their own miniature games and so on. So there's a whole world there that you can dig into that is beyond just the proxying of models for existing games. It's like a whole nother world there, and that's something that's really great to get into. So now if we come back again to the problem of 3D printing and why it hasn't taken over yet, or you know what it needs to do that in terms of technology to jump forward, we're moving into how to get into a level of technology on the desktop, in the home, at a good price point that is going to be a plug and play. And that is basically, you need to get it to a point where it's where there are no build supports, and that technology does exist. So on the really high-end 3D printers, you know, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, there is technology out there for printing that's done without supports actually being created for those parts. And I'm pretty sure it's a kind of powder version, and so you'll end up with a clean part that doesn't have any of that build material. And so this type of technology exists. So some form of that or something similar is going to have to be created at an effective price point for the home user, that is going to be hopefully a non-toxic version. Ultimately, that's what you would want, a non-toxic version that creates hopefully biodegradable version as well, that creates a kind of plastic type or resin type part which doesn't require build material or extremely minimal build material in order to produce it. And there needs to be basically no post-processing, like very little. You should be able to just take that part out, give it a quick clean up, and it should be ready to use. If they can get the technology to that point, then we'll see a sea change. Until you can create a part or a piece which doesn't require the kind of labor that 3D printing at the moment does, it's never going to supersede, you know, companies like Games Workshop and so on that produce miniatures, because it's just too easy to go down the shop and just buy the product. You know, yes, you're paying premium, but you're paying for the convenience as well. I mean, you don't have to do much. You just take it out of the box and it's ready to go. And plastic is really, really enjoyable to model with, you know, using poly cement and so on to glue the parts together. It's really lovely to work with. So it does have an edge, you know. That type of process is still sort of king. It's 3D printing is going to have to really push up its game and those companies that produce those printers do need to go another step again in order to really compete with that market. But as it stands right now, it's still an amazing part of this hobby, and I'm glad that it's slowly merging and becoming more and more prevalent. And there's tons of companies out there producing really great you know, things on Patreon, monthly offers, and you know, there's it's amazing to see. And yes, there is still that grey area of how much these companies are plagiarizing or copying and so on. And, you know, as I said, in terms of the user, it's more about just being considered and respectful to the products that you're using, especially if it's not done by a big company or it's a small, you know, independent artist or whatever. You want to make sure you stay respectful of their designs, and even if it is a big company like Games Workshop, you know, and if you're doing that, then there shouldn't be any issues. I don't see that that's going to be a problem. You know, obviously there is the whole argument of going to, like if you're doing Games Workshop stuff, you know, going to a Games Workshop event, obviously these models wouldn't be able to go to that event because they're using parts, I guess, that aren't Games Workshop, even though I would imagine conversions would be acceptable, but because it has whole sculpted pieces which aren't, I guess they're not going to be a legitimate thing to go in a tournament or in an event. But if you're not even going to tournaments or events, then none of that stuff really matters, right? If you're just playing with you and your mates, it should be totally fine. And most of us out there aren't really going to enter in events. It's a very small section of the community that actually actively involves themselves in events like that. And if you are, then you're going to build your armies accordingly. You're going to use Games Workshop product. You're going to do all that stuff so that you can actively participate. But outside of that, you get to enjoy all this lovely stuff here. And even then, certain tournaments that don't want to be as aligned with, you know, the company and so on, they'll allow 3D prints and all that kind of stuff, so you can still get into it. So yeah, at the moment it's a wild kind of free zone that it's full of opportunities and really amazing things to get into. You know, and I think that's just going to be great for the hobby in general, and because Games Workshop, let's face it, needs some competition, right? They have too much of a hold on the market, and so, you know, there's going to be some teething issues and some grey areas, but ultimately on the other side, I think it's going to be healthier in general because they need competition as well to help keep them, you know, on track and keep them honest. You know what I mean? You need those other companies to be there to push. That's in any market, in any capitalist system. You need competition. You can't have someone owning the market and monopolizing it, because it ends up turning toxic pretty quickly, and that's something that's really important. So yeah, there's just some thoughts I've got on this topic. Let me know what you think. I'd love to hear it. But you know, we're all, this isn't by any means, my opinion might change, your opinion might change. This is new ground we're entering into. It's so I would just say, ultimately, keep your mind open. You know, certainly participate, get a 3D printer. They're so cheap right now. You know, go onto My Mini Factory or onto Patreons or onto, you know, independent artists websites like mine, blightofgods.net. You know, download some stuff. You know, it's all pretty affordable. Print stuff out. You know, enjoy it. You know, get that into your hobby, because it is going to become more and more a part of how you interact with this hobby. You're not going to be just getting, you know, pre-bought miniatures. You are going to be doing that because it is really cost effective. So one last thing I'll talk on before I end is the cost. I mean, it's so cheap. Like, these are like on the LCD, not a Formlabs printer from you know, from Formlabs, but the, like, you know, any of the Anycubic or the Frozen, you know, Mighty 4K or any of those ones, the resin they're using, it's like 50 cents for one of these things. I mean, it's just insane. It's so cheap. Like, it's really, really cheap to print out, you know, something this size on, you know, it's amazing. It's like under $1. So you know, there is a real big incentive there to get into it, because it is going to reduce the cost of your time in the hobby. You'll be able to do a lot more, especially for things like terrain pieces or bases, you know, doing like base pieces and little terrain features and things that you want to add to do on your scenery, like on bigger bases like this. There's a huge potential there. Or just little parts, guns and little pieces and stuff that you want to add to your models. There's so much there, and it's extremely cheap. You know, it's even, you know, in Australia, it's very cheap. It's very cheap in America. In most countries, the resin for those printers is pretty affordable. It might be, you know, vary from country to country, but you're looking at under $1 for each of your pieces on this kind of size, and that's unreal, right? That's just so good. So yeah, it's definitely worth looking into. Obviously, go with your major brands, the Anycubics, the Frozens, all of those major ones that everyone loves. Do your research before you go into it, but you can get a really good affordable printer for around, you know, anywhere between $700 to $1,500. That's in Australian money, you know, around 1,000 Australian is the average, maybe about 1,200, and you'll get a decent like 4K LCD screen printer that will work really well. So, you know, I'm not going to tell you which one you should get. I'm using Frozen at the moment, but, you know, Anycubic's great too. There's tons of them there that do a good job, and you'll not look back. It's a pretty amazing part to add to your hobby, and it's like a magical experience. Getting your first print off the printer is pretty cool, right? It's like being a kid again. And if you are a kid, then that's obviously, you're going to get an extra bit of amazement there. But for all of us oldies, it does feel like magic, you know, seeing that, especially if it's your own sculpt. If you get into sculpting and you make your own thing like this, and then you see that come off the printer for the first time, it's such a cool thing to see. It's so fun. So I would highly recommend getting into it, you know, and just learning to deal with the mess and the fuss of it. You will get better at it, and you'll get more efficient at getting the prints off the printer and cleaning them up and doing all that post-processing that's involved. But it does get easier. Obviously, wear your safety gear, gloves, respirator mask that is designed for resin fumes. Not all masks are designed for that, so make sure it's got the right level, the right code on it that is used for resin. It'll be different country to country what that filter is, but you need to make sure you got the right filter, you know, eyewear, like eye protection and so on. But once you have all that sort of stuff, it becomes an easy process. Obviously, ventilated area, all those kind of things. So yeah, I hope you do get involved in it, and, you know, let me know in the comments what you think about it, or if you've had your own experiences with 3D printing and how you feel about it. But I think it's a pretty exciting and great new world, and hopefully it does eventually, you know, take over and become, you know, as the technology improves, a much easier way for people to enjoy, you know, these little toys that we love. So yeah, that's all my thoughts on that. Please like, subscribe, you know, hit that like button, all that stuff if you've enjoyed this, and I guess I'll catch you on the next one.